We're falling away from faith in general in America, but one of the remaining bastions of Christian faith is the Black community, along with the Hispanic community. And it may be that the pressures of injustice, not having alternative structures to lean on for just your daily bread, it may have induced a certain God-mindedness to people who felt that they were oppressed. So African Americans tend to have a more biblical worldview than the mainstream white community or even the Hispanic community. And the Hispanics are more so than the white community. African Americans attend church more frequently. They pray more regularly. Their devotional life and scriptural reading habits are higher than the mainstream community. And the average African American church is actually about twice the size of the average mainstream church in America.
We're so honored to have you with us, Bishop Harry Jackson. You are a spiritual leader in this country. You are an author of many books, among them High Impact African American Churches. You are Harvard Business School educated, and you've been featured in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, etc., etc. And you are a very highly respected person here in America who speaks about social conservatism and the need for believers not only to talk faith, but to live faith. And for this reason, we also respect you very much, and we wish for Europeans to learn from your example. And I've been on a search for quite a long time for true Christianity. And somehow in my studies here in the United States, I've noticed that many Christians leave the churches now. And these are studies on this. George Barna, we're going to talk about that. But it seems to me that especially many leave the white churches, and that there's an erosion of true faith, especially within the white communities, and that the African American community tends to stick more to the true values of religion. Would you agree?
As the great French philosopher said, La Montagne, that necessity is the mother of invention. And I believe that that's where we are. They knew, because of the pressure of the world, that we would need more help from the divine.
It's a paradox. I live in the Middle East, and when you look at the Orthodox Church, they also retain a very strong role of the priest as the psychologist, as the helper of the families. People deliver food to the churches, and the priest helps to distribute to orphans and widows. And there seems to be something that went really wrong with the Protestant church in its divisiveness and lack of empathy, it seems to me, in a self-righteous manner, and lack of solidarity and support for the weak and help to the poor. Is this a correct perception?
Well, I think that perception is transferable to America with a couple of exceptions, and that is that here in the States, the Roman Catholic Church has probably one of the finest social charity outreaches. But because of the problems that Roman Catholicism had with child abuse, pedophilia, and all the lawsuits brought against it, they have lost some of the clout they once have, and people have left. You'll find that many of our mainstream U.S. churches have some of the same problems that you reference of Europe and other places in the West, meaning that places that have remained biblically faithful to evangelical truths. And when I talk about evangelical, it comes from the word evangelism. In the Greek, it's the word euangelion, which means good news. And so at the heart of the biblical Christianity, there should be good news for the poor and for the sinners, people who have done historically bad things in their lives, and those who our culture would call disenfranchised. Jesus came preaching this gospel that was, as you say, was a paradox. The God who everyone believes wants you to keep the rules is willing to break the rule of tradition and reach out to the last, the least, and the lost, to the helpless of the cultures, and help them.
It's interesting for us to watch the African-American communities, and how would you define the strength of that particular type of Christianity in America?
Well, I would say that African-American faith community is more vibrant than, and it is also rivaled by the vibrancy of the Hispanic evangelical community, meaning lively praise, great community. They help one another. You'll find that even post Civil War and the Reconstruction eras in America, 1860s and et cetera, you'll find that churches came together in mutual aid societies. They created savings and loan institutions of their own. They helped people get mortgages because the regular finance community would not work with blacks and people who were previously slaves. And so the church became this hub. But I think we're at a point where America has been so blessed, and its blessing mirrors the financial blessing of the broader community, that we have. The Bible has an interesting phrase that says this: there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And it's talking about in Egypt, after Joseph's day of being like a prime minister and chief administrator, there finally came power in the secular community that didn't understand the heritage of faith of the Jewish people. I believe we're in this kind of crisis even in the American Black church. So we have remained faithful longer than probably any other major cultural group has to the basics and the reality of Christianity. But I do think that prosperity, it may be one of our greatest enemies, that sometimes when people feel like I can do this myself, they suddenly forget to go to church as frequently, or more importantly, serve the God in a sense that brought their people into the promised land of American freedom.
And one of the main reasons why we're looking into the question of African-American Christianity really is because one of the world's most renowned atheists, Jurgen Habermas, a German philosopher, he's been so detrimental to the European development of secularism. And a few years back, he came with a radical change of heart, and he stated that we have removed the Christian ethic, and that has been a mistake because we see that the Christian ethic was able to motivate individuals to do good to one another, and the erosion in Europe and the erosion of values in the US is threatening, these are my words, the first was what he said, are threatening democracy today, because if society becomes a place where there's only egoism and materialism, we are losing the very foundation for the fellowship and the solidarity between men. And my question to you is, would you say that white Christendom or white evangelicalism, what they call it here in the United States, has become bitten by the same kind of selfishness? Because when we look at these churches, you see the bless me attitude. Bless me, God bless me, God bless me, and then after that, maybe God bless my family, and then make me rich, make my family rich. And there's no really quest for using those riches, if you get rich, to benefit the community, which is the whole point, as I see it, in Christianity. So what went wrong with these dogmas?
I think that what our churches need is a renewal, and I hope that the danger that the world is facing with international security and division on so many different levels, racism, this whole issue of kind of sexual harassment, many things, I think that may drive individuals back to God out of a desperate need for meaning and empowerment. But what you're describing is really the phenomenon we see in the famous musical and movie. You remember The Hunchback of Notre Dame? And there's a scene in it where the wealthy people and the rich people basically are singing out and asking God to bless them. That's their prayer. And then the woman heroine in The Hunchback of Notre Dame sings a song, says, I ask for nothing. I can get by. There are so many less fortunate than I. God help the outcasts, the weak and downtrodden. I thought we all were the children of God. And what she was saying in her prayer and her song was that the least of these need God's help, and that the pompous and sometimes the pious have a religion of comfort, and they only want more, wherein her people, the gypsies in her culture, which could be Jewish people in some parts of the world, could be African Americans in the U.S., or Hispanic Americans, especially those who are recent immigrants who are still struggling with language and other things. They need God in a real, present way. And if Christianity remains strong, which I believe it will, we go through cycles of advancement and decline. What happened in America, the first Great Awakening, brought America back to the point of saying we believe in God, but with it, God required the social justice action of abolishment of slavery. Second Great Awakening in America, the same thing. University students were touched in the beginning of what is the American Foreign Missions Movement. My undergraduate alma mater, there was a group of people gathered at a haystack in Williamstown, Massachusetts, who they were afraid, they cried out to God, and they were well-to-do, but a personal revival caused them to go out to all the then Ivy League schools and preach to the students, take your opportunity, take your stature and status, and sacrifice everything on the altar of the purity of the reality of the gospel. Take the gospel to the four corners of the world, help needy people, help needy cultures, and the American Foreign Missions Movement, which literally has over the years given multiple billions of dollars to the least of these in our world, sprung out of a prayer meeting in a humble haystack. And so on and on and on. In our American history, it has been faith that has been rekindled that brings us back to core values and having an impact.
In the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, the virtue of humility is one of the greatest virtues. And of course, we know that humility comes probably if you are, looked down upon or subjugated in a society. You're more naturally, humble. But the question of this quality, because when we look at Jesus as well, he said we are to wash each other's feet, and not that the ministry is mine and this is my ministry, but that we all are humble servants, and we will never, regardless of how rich we become, we will never, as believers, be anything else than a humble servant. Maybe this is the route and the way into true spiritualism. Would you agree?
I would agree. Sometimes humiliation, if embraced with the right awareness from Scripture and God's Spirit, can produce humility. Other times, one of the problems I find now with Blacks and Hispanics in the U.S. context is that sometimes humiliation and tough external circumstances causes people to become bitter and hate and want to retaliate. And when they take that approach and even baptize their hatred in the name of justice, it's self-destructive. So my prayer is that the least of these in our culture would in fact find that place of humility at the foot of the cross and would embrace real, true Christian values. That group of people can lead the way to spiritual renewal in our land that may reverberate beyond our shores as well.
I know that you have worked with George Barna in examining precisely the African-American churches and the strength of the African-American Christian community here in the United States. Yeah. And I find his research very interesting, and I address it also in my latest book, The Culture War, because it's interesting to see how what they found was that it was actually the stronger Christians or the believers that wanted really to have a strong faith that were the ones that are leaving, especially the white churches in America, the mega churches, and many of these structures that have been looked upon as institutionalized Christendom in this country, and then they reform in groups, smaller church groups in the homes and everywhere. And I think this speaks for the landslide of lack of trust in the institutionalized church, so that Christians themselves become churchless due to the politicized and the political correctness and the selfishness that is going on, and phony faith.
Wow, strong words. I have recognized that dynamic. I think it's working both ways. Let's use this term, the genuine, maybe they're up and outers, who leave, meaning they are progressing in their faith. They find that megachurches are best at three things, really. They're best at well-organized events. They're best at serving a certain regional demographic. And they do, in a sense, thrive in prosperous or on the backs of the prosperity of the culture. And that none of those three things we talked about are in and of themselves inherently spiritual. I believe church in America is first a social entity, and its spiritual basis has also got to be developed. And so you've got some groups who figured out how to keep the social group intact and it to grow, become wealthy, to have an impact just through membership. Other groups have managed to, in fact, cultivate spirituality better. And so George Barna, who you cited earlier, has written several books on what should discipleship look like, meaning the passing on of the genuine faith one would pass a baton in a relay race. How do you pass that on to the next generation versus just serving the social needs of an organization of people? So, yeah, the institutional church is failing in the U.S., and trust in that church has waned over the last 2 decades from the stories of pedophilia and other things in both the Catholic and the Protestant churches. I think that was a starting point. Then the persistence of many manifestations of cultural prejudices. So I think we have our work to cut out for us, but I do believe that we're going to see, I pray this is really true, this is what I believe I see on the horizon, another great awakening where U.S. Christians return to their faith. I think to the extent that that really happens, a remnant from the Black church, a remnant from the Hispanic church may lead the way in this. But even the Black church has the potential of being an entertainment arts center. Some of the best singing, some of the best music in the entire world is sung in large AfricanAmerican and Hispanic churches. And I think that alone does not spiritual purity make. The fact that you can sing and put on performances.
I was in an audience a few years ago with the Archbishop of Jerusalem, Theophilus III. And in that meeting, we asked him, what should we do in Europe? Because the church is crumbling, the Protestant church is becoming very politically correct. They're all speaking only about being against gays or for gays, and the gay question really has taken down the whole church, as if God doesn't love gay people. So this is all they discuss. And then when you go to the Protestant groups, you see them isolated in small groups. They don't much talk to other people, and they're bullied in society on a whole. And then you go have the third group, which is the ones that are just preoccupied with asking God to bless them and make them rich. And what he said in that meeting was that you have to look to the heart. You have to look to the convents of the heart and to gather in groups those that are true believers and that seek humility. So this feels like a time of persecution as well, because not many shepherds seem to tend so much to the flock.
Well, I think that's great words that he shared. I agree with him. But I do think the shepherds in America, especially megachurches, I think they're tending to the flock, very much so. But distinction, I would say, is this. As I looked at you very well adorned for this television program, the difference is it's one thing to get made up for a television production. It's another thing to have true health that is beneath the skin. I could, given the right atmosphere and the right tools, I could make someone who is days away from passing away, I can make them look vibrant, I can make them look successful, and like they've got longevity that won't quit when they're really knocking at death's door, to coin an American phrase. And I think that dichotomy is what we face in our success-oriented culture in the U.S., and I would suspect in Europe. And years ago, a friend of mine, pastors, one of the largest churches in England. They brought out the TV cameras from the BBC and other groups, and they asked the question, why is this Nigerian and his African Caribbean church, why do they have, at that point, I think they had 10,000 plus members, why do they have 10,000 members? And then they looked over at this Anglican church, which had a huge building, and they had about 25 active members. And they began to say, well, what are these guys doing? But the stories were amazing, but they were looking for the secret to the life of the church only with the cosmetics. And even after that, years later, they said, they have too much money. We want to bring them under these African churches. We want to, African Caribbean, we want to bring them under investigation because we want to make sure they're doing the right thing with their money. They didn't realize that in that setting, it was the life beneath the surface that was creating what was the health on the surface. The byproduct of tremendous ministry was that people had enough money to tithe. They prospered and were doing well, not because they sought prosperity, but because the rare shepherds in that group tended to the spiritual needs of the people. A few years after that, we noticed that many of those pastors, African Caribbean pastors in England, many of them, like America, we had scandals with some televangelists. Many of them went off to jail, they'd done terrible things, but those guys themselves had been caught up on surface Christianity versus living and discipling people in the bedrock of the genuine faith. So I'm hopeful that we're going to see a resurgence of that genuine faith. I'm hopeful that Europe is going to see it as well. But the believing church in Europe often, how can I say it, is as small numerically as the number of Christians in a place like India. 5% of the population are evangelical Christians attending churches in India, and you probably have less than 5% in a nation like the UK that is attending church.
And in closing, Bishop, we would like to ask your advice to the European believers and to the Europeans atheists and to the European agnostics and to all the humanists. Which advice would you give us and which path should we follow so that we may help our societies get back some of that solidarity and kindness and empathy that we now are lacking?
Well, I think it comes down to two very simple things. Number one, we've got to get back to the Bible. And whether you read a physical Bible or if you listen, I read and I listen to something called Daily Audio Bible, which just talks to you from the Word. It seems that churches all over the world that are dying, they have gotten away from reading or listening to the Bible and attempting to obey it on a regular basis personally. And then secondly, they have failed to assemble with other believers that are on fire, assemble to worship, and then to have a combined strategy to serve the community in which they've been placed. So if we do those two things, recommit to the Bible and living it, recommit to public worship services with other real believers, and serving the community in which we're set, I think you'll see as Charles Finney, the great American revivalist, said, you'll have a revival of religion.
Thank you very much, Bishop Harry Jackson, for taking the time to tell us your analysis on the American society and American Christendom. And we will take to heart your advice and make sure that many see your program so they can learn much from your great voice of faith here in America. Thank you.
Thank you.